From that idea of a hidden platform that only appears at midnight, the journey quietly settles into the region where most players first open their eyes to the Pokémon world. Kanto at night exists only in imagination in the original games. Yet the way the region is laid out still feels like a slow evening walk that keeps looping back toward home. Pallet Town is the first example of this. A tiny cluster of houses, a lab, and a shoreline that almost feels too simple. And that simplicity is intentional, acting as a calm starting point before anything dangerous appears. The soft, looping music, with its gentle rise and fall, was designed as a kind of musical lullaby, so players could wander in circles there and still feel safe, with no wild Pokémon in the grass and no complicated paths to manage. It is a place where nothing much happens, and that quiet is part of why many still think of it as home, even after crossing the whole region. Did you know the original red and green cartridges were so limited that many areas in Kanto ended up feeling oddly empty, as if something was missing just off-screen? Sparse furniture, repeated tiles, and long stretches of apparently useless space were not hints at secret Pokémon, but simple memory-saving choices. However, players later walked through these blank-feeling rooms and corridors and began to imagine hidden switches, invisible items, or doors to unreleased areas, and some claimed these gaps were proof that content had been removed at the last minute. The earliest Pokémon centers and Pokemarts were designed as the opposite of those blank spaces. Brightly lit rooms with clear counters and warm colors that stood out against the darker, more muted overworld palette. The healing jingle is only a few seconds long, but it was intentionally kept short and soothing, so hearing it hundreds of times would not become harsh or tiring, especially for players staying up late. According to some, that sound became a kind of audio checkpoint, a reminder that no matter how long a route felt, there was always a quiet refuge waiting at the end. Kanto's map itself was built in a loop, gently guiding players back toward familiar routes rather than pushing them endlessly forward. Routes 1 and 2 lead away from Pallet Town, but later paths and shortcuts bend back, letting players pass through Viridian Forest again, there revisit Pewter and Cerulean, and surf along coasts that once seemed unreachable. One common rumor is that this looping layout hid secret branches, that a perfectly timed movement or a hidden HM could open an extra path behind a familiar ledge, though this was easily debunked by players who combed through every tile. Although the rumors are false, that sense of something unseen hiding in a simple map helped strange myths grow even in this quiet first region. Empty corners near Cinnabar, a truck near Vermilion, and strange glitchy encounters on the coast would soon become stories about missing hidden Pokémon, and ghostly presences that did not appear in any official guide. As the calm tour of Kanto continues, those gentle looping roads will start to cross directly into the earliest, eeriest myths, including one truck, one ghost, and a Pokémon that was never meant to be seen at all. From those quiet roads and a single abandoned truck, the journey through Kanto's myths eventually leads players to the most quietly famous town of all, Lavender Town, a place that, did you know, is one of the rare locations in a children's game that openly centers on death, mourning, and remembrance, yet does so in a way that feels hushed and respectful, rather than like a horror story. The sky is gray, the houses are simple, and instead of jump scares, the game just lets players walk slowly among gravestones and grieving trainers. In the original Japanese Red and Green, the tower there is simply called Pokemon Tower, and from the moment players enter Lavender Town, the music does most of the work, with a thin, almost whistling melody that feels slightly off-kilter even at low volume. The composer used slightly detuned notes and unusual intervals, so that even though nothing loud or sudden happens on screen, some claimed the tune would linger in their heads long after the Game Boy was turned off, like a memory half remembered from a dream. As the games spread and the internet grew, that uneasy melody turned into one of Pokémon's most infamous rumors. One common rumor is that the original Lavender Town music in Japan caused headaches, nightmares, or worse in younger players, and that the track was secretly changed for overseas releases to prevent harm. Another rumor said that hidden high-pitched tones in the song could only be heard by children and would somehow cause distress. However, this was easily debunked once fans extracted the game's audio data and compared regional versions side by side. No medical reports, no official statements, and no verifiable cases have ever supported the idea that the music caused real-world damage. And although the rumors are false, they spread quickly because they matched what players already felt: that this quiet town was different, and that the game had briefly stepped into heavier territory than usual. This rumor likely stems from the way the track uses those strange intervals and the way early internet creepypasta liked to attach dangerous consequences to things players already found eerie. Inside Pokémon Tower itself, the game turns that unease into a kind of vertical journey through grief, with each floor filled with trainers who are not just there to battle, but to mourn. Some are crying, some are praying, some speak in short, stunned lines about partners they lost, and as players climb, the ghosts shift from wild encounters to the restless spirit of Kubone's mother, giving the simple act of ascending floors a feeling of slowly processing a loss and coming to terms with it. According to some later stories, Lavender Town hides even darker secrets, from glitched sprites that would appear at midnight to cartridges that whisper different messages. But these creepypasta tales are works of fiction layered on top of a game that was already unusually somber. By gently separating the myths from the actual design, players can notice how the combination of gray skies, ghost-type Pokémon, and that tall grave tower created a legend that felt much larger than its tiny map. And as the calm tour continues, other myths about hidden Pokémon and unseen ghosts will echo this same blend of quiet unease and careful storytelling. After leaving the quiet gray of Lavender Town, players eventually drift down to Vermilion City, a brighter harbor that still hides one of the strangest blank spaces in the original games. A tiny piece of scenery that felt like it had to be important, even though the code said otherwise. Just beyond the SS Anne, past the point where most players ever walk, there is a single truck sprite sitting alone on a hidden dock, surrounded by water and silence. Under normal play, the ship departs once the ticket is used, and the harbor map can never be visited again. So almost no one would ever notice that truck on a first casual journey. Did you know the only way to see it is to avoid battling the sailor who blocks the pier? Keep the SS Anne in port, and then return much later with surf, slipping around the edge of the harbor to a small strip of land that feels like a secret room the developers forgot to lock. The truck does not move. It does not flash. It just waits. This stillness made it perfect for rumors. One common rumor is that if players used strength on the truck, Mew would appear from underneath, as if it had been hiding in the shadows of Vermilion the entire time. Some claimed the process was even more elaborate, involving defeating the Elite Four a certain number of times, filling the Pokédex, or talking to every NPC on the ship before it left, then returning to the truck to claim a hidden reward that only the most dedicated trainers could earn. Another rumor said that the truck would respond if specific items were held in the bag, or if a particular starter Pokémon was in the first slot of the party. And according to some, pressing A while circling the truck in a perfect loop, would cause it to slide aside and trigger a special battle theme. However, this was easily debunked once players began digging through the game's data. The truck is just a background tile, with no event, no flag, and no programmed encounter attached to it at all. Although the rumors are false, they felt believable because Mew was real, mentioned in magazines and official material, yet unobtainable in normal gameplay. And the truck was a strange, out-of-the-way object that looked like it existed for a purpose. The idea that a mythical Pokémon could be hidden in plain sight, waiting under a piece of scenery that almost no one reached, fit perfectly with the feeling that these early games still contained undiscovered corners. Later, official distributions and the famous Trainerfly glitch showed that Mew was added through events and programming quirks, not secret trucks. This rumor likely stems from players mixing that genuine mystery with the thrill of having knowledge that others did not. And over time, fan games and ROM hacks began to play along, adding their own events under the truck, from gift Mews to joke encounters, turning the old myth into a knowing wink. As the Calm Tour continues, that other legends about hidden Pokémon would grow even more elaborate than a single silent vehicle, reaching beyond trucks and docks toward entire islands and unfinished regions that some said were just off-screen. From a silent truck on a harbor to something even stranger, the next legend did not hide behind scenery at all, but inside the code itself, waiting along a strip of coastline and a line of text in your trainer card. In the original Red and Blue, players eventually gave this presence a name that sounded more like an error message than a Pokémon. Missing No, short for missing number, a placeholder creature created by the game's data structure and never meant to be seen on any normal journey. In simple terms, the game needed somewhere to point when it referenced data that did not exist, so several unused index slots were filled with this blank stand-in, a kind of ghost entry that sat between real Pokémon in the internal list. Did you know it when players talked to the old man in Viridian City for his catching tutorial? The game temporarily overwrote the player's name in memory so it could display Old Man instead, then quietly put the name data somewhere else for safekeeping, assuming nothing strange would happen before it was restored. However, just south of Cinnabar Island, the long vertical coastline created unusual encounter spaces, meaning tiles where the game tried to generate wild Pokémon, but did not have proper route data attached, so it reached for whatever information was nearby in memory. This meant the game would sometimes read the bytes of the player's name as if they were encounter slots, turning letters into species and levels. And when those values pointed to unused entries, the result on screen would be Missing No, rising out of the waves as if the ocean itself had glitched. The first time players met it, the experience felt almost surreal, with a scrambled, blocky sprite that looked more like broken television static than a creature, a distorted cry, and then, in many cases, a sudden jump in the quantity of the sixth item in the bag. Some claimed this was a secret way to duplicate rare candies or master balls placed in that slot, and according to some, encountering Missing No was less a bug and more like discovering a forbidden developer shortcut that only the bravest or most curious were allowed to see. Of course, the game was not entirely unharmed. The Hall of Fame records could become corrupted, filling with glitched sprites and unreadable names, and the overworld might briefly show graphical oddities such as stretched lines or flickering tiles, which faded once players changed locations. No, another rumor said that Missing No would instantly erase save files or destroy cartridges, though this was largely false, as most encounters ended with the adventure continuing as normal, just with a strangely inflated item stack and a story to tell at school the next day. This rumor likely stems from the way early Pokemon games already felt mysterious and fragile, with strange caves, empty houses, and unused corners of the map that seemed to promise hidden content. So any glitch could easily be framed as a doorway into something secret. In that sense, Missing No became part of the gentle chaos that defined the era, a reminder that behind the familiar sprites and music, there was imperfect machinery, and that those imperfections gave players room to imagine other hidden Pokemon, other unfinished islands, and other strange encounters that some said were still waiting in the data just off-screen, leading into even more myths about lost maps and unreachable regions. And just off-screen, behind all those rumors about unfinished islands and secret maps, the game was still quietly doing math, every single turn, as if the cartridge itself was keeping a calm little ledger of risk and reward. Did you know that in the earliest games, every Pokeball throw was not pure luck at all, but the result of a hidden formula, humming away in the background while players held their breath and watched the ball shake? Instead of chaos, each throw in red, blue, and yellow used the target's remaining HP, its invisible catch rate, and any status condition to decide whether the ball would click shut or burst open. So lowering a Pokemon to 1 HP with false swipe or a lucky critical hit did more than feel satisfying. It quietly tilted the numbers in the player's favor. The game would compare that invisible value to another hidden roll, and although the screen only showed 3 gentle shakes, there were actually several internal checks, like a soft conversation between the code and the creature. Some claimed that tapping A at the right moment or holding down and B could change this. But the cartridge never looked at the buttons during that part at all, and however this was easily debunked once players dug into the data. Status moves, now which many skipped in favor of raw damage, were secretly some of the strongest tools for catching, because putting a Pokemon to sleep or paralyzing it increased that hidden catch value before the game even considered the ball. Sleep and freeze were the most powerful, paralysis and poison a little weaker, but all of them nudged the formula, like a quiet hand on the scale. So Hypnosis, Thunder Wave, and Spore were quietly more valuable than another random tackle. According to some early guides, players should never waste time with these moves. Yet the code itself disagreed, rewarding patience and setup over rushing. Critical hits in Generation 1 followed a similarly strange but consistent rule, tied not to luck alone, but to a Pokemon's base speed. So faster species like Persian, Jolteon, and Fearow would land critical hits far more often than slower tanks such as Snorlax or Onix. One common rumor is that certain moves were cursed to crit more often for story reasons, but the truth was that the game simply multiplied the user's speed, then compared it to another hidden threshold, so a fast Pokemon with Slash could feel as if it was critting almost every turn. The result was a battle system that seemed wild and unpredictable, while still following the same quiet pattern every time. The game never explained any of this directly, leaving players to trade half-true explanations on the playground. And although the rumors are false about buttons and secret luck stats, the feeling they came from is real, because the world did behave as if it had rules just out of sight. Under the bright sprites and looping music, the Pokemon world ran on these consistent, predictable systems. And there was something strangely soothing about knowing that every catch, every critical hit, and every narrow escape was guided by the same hidden structure, leading into even more subtle mechanics that shaped how encounters felt long before players understood why. Those hidden numbers and encounter tables made Kanto feel ordered. But in Johto, those same invisible rules started to move with the clock on the wall, as if the game itself began breathing in time with players. Gold and silver quietly shifted from a world that only pretended to change into one that watched the actual hour and let the light on the screen fade with the sky outside. Did you know these were the first mainline Pokémon games to include a real-time clock that never stopped ticking, even when the power was off and the Game Boy was closed away in a drawer? The colors on the overworld would slide from bright daytime palettes into deep oranges at evening, and then into cool blues at night. And the encounter tables changed with them, so that Hoothoot and Spinarak only rustled out of the grass after dark, while Pidgey and Sentret preferred the safety of the morning. Some claimed this made Johto feel strangely alive, because the same patch of grass could hold a different cast of Pokémon depending on when players visited. According to some development interviews, the director was inspired by how different his own hometown felt at night, when the shops were closed, the streets were quieter, and the familiar buildings seemed to belong to a smaller, more private world. That feeling of walking down the same road under streetlights instead of sunlight was translated directly into Johto's roots and cities, with lamps flickering on in Goldenrod, shadows lengthening around Ecrutake's towers, and the soft suggestion that NPCs had unseen routines when players were not watching. One common rumor is that certain background characters would eventually go home if players waited long enough. Though this was false, the mood of the region made that idea feel believable. Though visiting Route 29 in the afternoon, then returning late at night, turned into a calming ritual for many players, who noticed how different Pokémon appeared, as if the world followed its own quiet rhythm. The same thing happened in places like Dark Cave, or the outskirts of National Park, where the music and lighting stayed gentle, but the encounter tables shifted, so that your journey felt less like a static maze and more like a place that kept its own schedule. Another rumor said that coming back to certain routes at midnight increased shiny odds, and however this was easily debunked, it shows how strongly players felt that Johto's nights were hiding something special. Time of day even reached into evolution itself, with Eevee branching into Espeon under the morning and daytime sun, or Umbreon under the calm of night, but only if friendship had been raised high enough first. Players were encouraged to walk with their Eevee for many in-game days, battle together, avoid letting it faint, and check its happiness again and again, until that final level up at just the right hour quietly rewarded all that patience. Although the rumors are false that neglect or fainting at midnight could create a hidden third form, the real mechanic already carried a gentle message that the bond between trainer and Pokémon grew over time across mornings and evenings. Johto also hid some of the series' most subtle, easily missed details, from tiny dialogue changes on different days to background NPC stories that only advanced if players returned after time had passed. Even the radio stations shifted their programming with the day of the week, suggesting lives continuing just off-screen, and hinting that more secrets might be buried in the clock than anyone had yet proven. As the series moved forward, later regions would push this idea even further, tying in tides, weather, and seasons. And one of those experiments would lead to a mechanic that quietly rewrote how rare Pokémon could appear at all. That quiet focus on time and cycles fits neatly into Johto's towns, where almost every street and rooftop feels like it has been watching the clock for centuries. In Johto, players eventually reach Ecruteak City, a place that seems to exist halfway between the present and something older, with the Burn Tower and the Bell Tower standing at opposite ends like bookends, holding together a legend that never fully speaks above a whisper. The Burn Tower is especially calm in a haunting way, its collapsed beams and darkened floors suggesting an old disaster that the game never dramatizes on screen, but always lets players feel in the background. According to some NPCs, This was once the Brass Tower, home to a great rainbow-colored Pokémon, and the fire that destroyed it is described in soft, almost ceremonial language, as if the city has repeated the story so often that it has worn smooth over time. Just across town, the bell tower rises clean and bright, its wooden halls and wine chimes making it sound like the opposite of the ruins below. Yet both structures are tied to the same quiet myth. Did you know the legends of Ho-Oh and Lugia are presented less like boss introductions and more like guardian folklore, scattered through dialogue and scenery instead of shouted cutscenes? Some claimed Ho-Oh watches from the skies above the bell tower, blessing those who prove their heart, while Lugia rests beneath the Whirl Islands, hidden under waves and mist. And the games let players slowly assemble this from monks, sages, and item descriptions, rather than from any single explanation. The trio of nameless Pokémon that perished in the fire, later revived as the legendary beasts, turned the burned tower into a kind of unmarked memorial. And the fact that their story is fragmented only adds to the feeling that players are walking through an old oral tradition, not a modern exposition dump. Ecrutake's Kimono Girls tie these threads together in an almost ritual-like sequence, moving with slow, graceful animations and speaking in calm, measured lines that contrast sharply with more energetic trainers. One common rumor is that their battles secretly adjust hidden values or change encounter odds for certain legendary Pokémon, a belief that likely comes from how carefully their scenes are staged, with traditional music and choreographed exits making everything feel more important than a normal challenge. Although the rumors are false, the impression remains that these NPCs are caretakers of Johto's mythology, like guiding players through performances that feel closer to ceremonies than to standard trainer battles. Johto's architecture and sound design strengthen this mood further, with tiled roofs, sliding door interiors, and gentle pentatonic melodies drawing from traditional Japanese aesthetics to create a region that feels nostalgic even on a first visit. Many players have said that walking through Ecrutake at night with its lantern-like lights and subdued theme feels almost like exploring a dream of an old hometown that never actually existed. And this atmosphere extends to places like Cherry Grove, Violet City, and the path to the Ilex Forest Shrine. As players move through Johto, the focus on history and tradition quietly mirrors their own journey, suggesting that becoming a champion is less about replacing the past and more about inheriting and respecting it. From the towers of Ecrutake to the shrines and ruins hidden off the main road, that idea would echo again in later regions, where distant islands, desert temples, and even abandoned laboratories would hint that every badge and every legendary encounter sits on top of something older, waiting to be uncovered in the dark. In Johto, that sense of something older beneath the surface is not just in towers and shrines, but also in the quiet signals drifting through the air that players can barely see, only tune into. Gold and Silver introduced the Pokegear radio. And did you know this was one of the first times a mainline Pokemon game asked players to think about sound as part of the world itself, not just as background music? Different stations would fade in and out, depending on the time of day and even which route players were standing on. So the region felt like it was breathing, broadcasting, and changing whether anyone was watching or not. In the morning, the Pokemon talk show would chatter about routes and encounters. Now, while at night the music shifted, the playlists grew softer, and some claimed that certain tracks made wild encounters feel different, even though this was never confirmed in the code. Another rumor said that carefully timing the radio to the hour could influence which Pokemon appeared, the way the day-night cycle already did on the overworld. And although the rumors are false, the idea shows how easily players connected invisible radio waves with hidden mechanics. The developers quietly reinforced that feeling by letting special broadcasts take over the airwaves during story events. So the radio was not just a menu option, but a reminder that Johto kept moving even when the screen faded to black. Nowhere does that feel stranger than at the ruins of Alph, where the ancient and the technological brush against each other in a way that feels slightly off. The ruins themselves are a small, optional area off Route 32, but inside, the music drops into a sparse, echoing track, and the walls are lined with puzzles and unknown inscriptions that most players cannot read on a first visit. According to some, this was the point. The designers wanted the ruins to feel older than the Johto League, older than Pokeballs, like players had stumbled into a site that scholars had only half understood. Here, the Pokegear stops being comforting and becomes something else. If players tune the radio while standing near the ruins of Alph, the normal stations dissolve into distorted tones and strange beeping patterns, as if the device is picking up a signal that should not be there. One common rumor is that these sounds are actually coded messages from the Unown themselves, and some claimed that playing them back in slow motion would reveal a hidden cry for a secret Pokémon sealed beneath the ruins. However, this was easily debunked by data miners, who confirmed that beyond the unknown forms, there are no extra Pokémon tied to this location, just carefully arranged puzzles, item placements, and that unsettling sound design. This rumor likely stems from how the Unown chambers change as players solve each sliding tile puzzle, dropping them into new rooms and subtly changing the encounter tables, so it feels as though the ruins are responding. Even knowing the truth, the environmental storytelling still works. The Unown alphabet, the research notes from nearby scientists, and the way the radio reacts, all combine to make the ruins of Alph feel like a place where the game is not telling players everything. In nearly every region, there is at least one spot like this, from desert temples in Hoenn to abandoned labs in later games, where the music shifts, the NPC dialogue grows vague, and the mechanics encourage players to linger a little longer than usual, wondering what might still be hiding just beyond the edge of the screen, or just outside the range of the next signal. And in Johto, that quiet question continues beyond the ruins, following the radio waves up into the tin roofs and burned beams of Ecruteak, where legends and static mix together in the night. From Ecruteak's crackling radios and flickering legends, players eventually drift out over the sea, into a region where the horizon feels wider and the air feels warmer, and almost every path seems to lead back to the water. Hoenn is a place where the map itself breathes with the ocean, with long routes of rolling waves, scattered islands, and coastal towns that feel open and breezy, as if the entire region was built to let the tide and wind pass straight through it. Did you know that in Ruby and Sapphire, nearly half the region is ocean or shoreline, turning travel itself into a kind of slow, rhythmic exercise, as players surf past small rocks, diving spots, and quiet coves that many only visit once? Towns like Slateport and Lily Cove are drawn right up against the water, their harbors and beaches suggesting that ships have been coming and going here long before any Pokémon League, and even the sound design leans into gentle surf and distant bird calls. So the world feels like it is resting between waves. Hidden within this waterlogged map is one of Hoenn's calmest mechanics, the tide system of Shoal Cave, north of Mossdeep. At first glance, it is just another optional cave off a surf route, but according to some players who explored it carefully, the entire layout seems to change depending on when you visit. In reality, The cave is tied to the internal clock, so the water level rises and falls on a schedule, quietly switching between high tide and low tide, without any dramatic cutscene or warning. At high tide, cold seawater fills the lower chambers, blocking certain paths, but carrying in wild Pokémon and floating ice. While at low tide, the water drains away to reveal sandy floors, hidden rooms, and items that could not be reached before. Some claimed there had to be a secret trigger, a hidden switch, or a rare event that controlled this flooding, but the truth is gentler than any rumor. The cave simply waits, and the game expects players to wait with it. Because of this, Shoal Cave encourages a different pace, almost a meditative loop, where players leave, do something else in Hoenn, and then return later to see what has changed. Instead of rushing through in a single visit, players who pay attention to the clock can slowly collect shoal salt and shoal shells across multiple tides, turning the cave into a quiet routine and teaching that patience and repetition can be rewarding, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening on screen. Outside the cave, Hoenn's routes use weather in a similar, softly insistent way. Some stretches are drenched in constant rain, others glow under harsh sunlight, and a few are swept by sandstorms, with visibility fading and the music slightly muffled, as if the landscape itself is breathing differently. One common rumor is that certain rare Pokémon would only appear under specific weather on these routes. And although the rumors are false, the feeling behind them makes sense, because the mood really does change with each climate. Over time, these gentle systems quietly teach that Hoenn is not just a backdrop, but a living environment, where tides, clouds, and wind move on their own schedule, and many secrets only reveal themselves to players willing to revisit the same shore, the same cave, or the same stormy route at a different hour, before the journey carries them on toward regions where nature feels colder, stranger, and even more deliberate. After spending time with Hoenn's moving tides and drifting clouds, players were also given something much smaller and more personal, a quiet reminder that the region was not only a place to travel through, but a place to quietly live in for a while, tucked away behind an unremarkable tree or inside a shallow cave wall. In Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, secret bases turned ordinary map tiles into hidden homes, so that a regular-looking hole in a rock face or a patch of suspicious ivy could suddenly lead into a private room that belonged only to the player who discovered it. Did you know that the act of creating a secret base was almost ritualistic, asking players to use the TM for secret power on specific walls, roots, or clumps of vines, so that the scenery itself would quietly open and reveal a hollow interior? Some claimed certain spots were luckier than others, that a base in a tree near Fortree City would attract rarer visiting trainers, or that a cave base near Meteor Falls somehow increased the chance of finding certain Pokémon nearby. Though this was false, and the game treated each entrance in a much simpler way. Inside these bases, the tone changed from adventure to something closer to domestic calm, as players laid down simple mats, lined up dolls of favorite Pokémon, and placed potted plants or cushions in careful rows that had nothing to do with stats, type matchups, or story progression. According to some, arranging decorations in a certain pattern could unlock hidden events. Another rumor said that filling a base with one specific doll, like Skitty or Azurill, would cause a related wild encounter to appear outside. However, this was easily debunked once players compared data and realized the decorations were purely cosmetic, designed for expression rather than power. The link cable and later wireless features added a quieter kind of presence to all of this, because when players mixed records, their friends' secret bases would quietly appear throughout their own Hoenn, turning empty alcoves into signs that someone else existed just off-screen, training and decorating somewhere beyond the next ledge. One common rumor is that battling a friend's team in their imported base would secretly raise the friendship values of your own Pokémon faster, as if the game recognized that these were familiar faces in a familiar place. Although the rumors are false, and the mechanic was simply an optional way to rematch customized teams. For many, returning to a secret base after long routes felt like coming home, a small refuge where the music softened. The outside world stopped moving, and nothing asked the player to hurry. Features like this suggest the developers understood that some players wanted to simply exist in the Pokémon world, to sit on a mat beside a tiny pixel plant and listen to the looping bass theme, before stepping back outside into a region where other hidden spaces and other stranger secrets were still waiting just off the main path. Just outside those quiet secret bases and hidden rooms, Hoenn held another kind of secret space, one that most players only heard about in half-finished stories and late-night conversations. Instead of a cozy mat or a tiny plant, these places were described as empty seas, distant docks, and islands that only appeared for a few lucky cartridges. Did you know that in the data for the Generation 3 games, there are entire islands most players never reached, like Birth Island, Faraway Island, and Naval Rock, each holding a single legendary Pokémon and almost nothing else. Birth Island was tied to Deoxys, with a strange black triangle puzzle that some claimed would move faster or slower, depending on how carefully the player approached it. While Faraway Island quietly hid a wild Mew deep in the tall grass, and Naval Rock rose out of the ocean with Ho-Oh at its peak and Lugia in its depths. On the map screen they looked ordinary, but in practice they felt like places that were never quite meant to be seen. For many players, these locations were first encountered as rumors, not as destinations on their own save files. One common rumor is that someone's cousin, or an older sibling's friend, had gone to a special store event, connected a link cable, and then somehow been ferried to a mysterious island with no music change and only a single Pokémon waiting. Another rumor said that if players defeated the Elite Four a certain number of times, or filled the Pokédex without trading, a sailor in a distant port would quietly offer a new trip, though this was false. Fact-checking the rumor using early forums was difficult, so according to some, the safest option was to keep trying just in case. In reality, these islands were real, but they were locked behind official items like the Aurora ticket for Birth Island, the Mystic ticket for Naval Rock, and the old sea map for Faraway Island in the Japanese version of Emerald. And these were not rewards for obscure button presses or for standing in a specific tile at a specific time. They were distributions, handed out at events or through limited promotions, which meant that many cartridges carried the map data, but never received the key needed to sail there. This rumor likely stems from the way the locations felt half-present, visible to data miners and magazine screenshots, but unreachable in ordinary play. For the few players who did arrive, the atmosphere was strikingly quiet. The boat would dock, the NPC would fall silent, and the island itself would usually contain only simple geometry, a staircase, or a patch of grass, with one legendary Pokémon standing alone. The encounter with Deoxys on Birth Island, reached after chasing that shifting triangle, felt more like walking into a dream than finishing a quest. Meeting Mew on Faraway Island, or watching it dart into the grass and forcing players to play a gentle game of hide-and-seek before the battle even began, created a sense that this was a secret meant for a very small audience. Although the rumors are false about hidden in-game methods to unlock these places, the feeling they created was real. For many players, Hoenn's event islands existed more as whispered possibilities than as locations on a personal map. Even now, thinking about a boat that never arrives and an island that never loads can make the Pokemon world feel larger than the screen, and can make players wonder what other spaces might be sleeping just beyond the edge of the region, waiting to be imagined, if not explored. From those distant Hoenn Islands that many players never reached, the series moves quietly north, into a region that feels colder, not just in temperature, but in mood, as if the air itself is slower and heavier. Sinnoh's upper half, especially around Snow Point City and Lake Acuity, almost seems designed to make players lower their internal volume. And did you know Diamond and Pearl's developers used surprisingly subtle tricks to make that feeling sink in? Snow Point City is one of the clearest examples, with snow that does not fall in a simple looping pattern, but drifts at slightly different speeds and angles, so that no two moments on screen look quite the same. The flakes slide diagonally, then straighten, then thicken, and the way the wind seems to shift without any dramatic sound effect makes the town feel genuinely cold, as though the screen itself has a chill. Some claimed this kind of detail hinted at hidden mechanics, like special encounter rates tied to the way the snow moved, though nothing in the code supports that. And instead the effect is more like a visual lullaby, gently repeating but never perfectly repeating, encouraging players to stand still and watch. The northern routes leading to Snow Point lean into that mood, using a muted color palette where whites, grays, and deep evergreens replace the brighter tones of earlier paths. And the music softens into slow, almost music box-like phrases with long-held notes. According to some, these areas felt emptier than other regions because there were fewer buildings and less obvious activity. But that sparsity is what makes them work. The distance from busy civilization is not just geographical, it is emotional. And the game quietly communicates that through color and sound rather than dialogue. Even the trainers on these routes speak in short, restrained lines, as if the cold has shortened their thoughts. Lake Acuity, and by extension the trio of Sinnoh's lakes, turns that quiet into something almost ceremonial, with still water surfaces framed by snow or forest that invite players to pause before stepping forward. Unlike more dramatic legendary arenas filled with roaring music and flashing lights, these lakes host Pokemon tied to emotion, knowledge, and will. And the atmosphere reflects that. The encounters feel contemplative rather than explosive, as if the game wants players to think about why these beings are here, instead of how strong they are. One common rumor is that visiting the lakes in a specific order could change the legendary trio's behavior. But however this was easily debunked, the idea matches the mood. Calm spaces that seem like they might respond to quiet rituals. Sound design supports all of this, with the gentle crunch of footsteps in snow replacing the usual grassy rustle, and the way each terrain in Sinnoh slightly reshapes the noise of movement, from frozen ground to wooden bridges to icy caves. These differences are small, and many would miss them while rushing. But if players slow down, the repeated crunch becomes almost hypnotic, a soft metronome measuring out lonely paths and frozen shorelines. Although the rumors are false about secret events tied to these sounds, the careful audio work makes the stillness feel more physical, as if the cold is something that can be heard as well as seen. Together, Sinnoh's quiet north turns solitude into a theme rather than an accident, creating places where players can feel alone without feeling abandoned, surrounded by snow, distant trees, and gently falling light. In a series often remembered for crowded cities and busy battle themes, these routes and lakes suggest that the Pokemon world also has long, empty stretches where nothing urgent happens, and that this emptiness has value. That sense of peaceful distance will appear again in later regions, where developers keep experimenting with weather, sound, and space to make players feel small in a calm way rather than a frightening one, and where the world's quiet corners continue to hide details that are easy to miss when the volume is turned up too high. That idea of quiet space becomes even clearer in Sinnoh's strangest location, a place that looks dangerous at first glance, but settles into something slow and dreamlike once players step inside. In Platinum, the story eventually pulls players into the Distortion World, an alternate dimension centered around Giratina, where the usual rules of gravity and perspective seem to have been taken apart and rearranged. Instead of straight paths and clear floors, the Distortion World stacks platforms at odd angles, tilts trees sideways, and hangs pillars upside down, so the horizon never feels quite stable, and yet nothing is rushing to attack. So, did you know some players at the time even said this area felt more like a puzzle from another franchise than a traditional Pokémon route, because of how rarely wild encounters break the silence and how the geometry seems designed only to be stared at. The water surfaces act like mirrors, the sky feels too close, and Giratina waits far away, almost politely. The sound design adds to that gentle unease, because unlike the bold battle themes and town music that fill most of Sinnoh, the Distortion World uses almost no melody at all, just faint tones and distant echoes, so long pauses of near silence stretch between footsteps. According to some early impressions, players expected a loud, chaotic final dungeon, but instead found something that behaves more like a surreal dream than a nightmare, where the strangest sights arrive quietly and then drift away. Nothing jumps out of the darkness, and there is no timer counting down. And movement inside this space is also slowed on purpose. Platforms rise and sink with a steady, unhurried rhythm, while the camera glides around corners and rotates to follow the twisting paths, rather than snapping suddenly. This pacing encourages players to stand still for a moment, watch a platform complete its cycle, and only then decide what to do next. One common rumor is that rushing through the Distortion World would somehow change the outcome of the Giratina encounter. But however, this was easily debunked once players tested different approaches and found the same calm resolution every time. For many fans, this was the first time a Pokémon game presented a truly abstract space, with no clear real-world inspiration, no houses, and almost no NPCs, which made the memory of it linger long after the credits. Some claimed the area was too unsettling, while others said it felt strangely peaceful, like wandering through a half-finished sketch of a region that only exists in a dream. Although the rumors are false that hidden doors or secret legendaries are tucked in unreachable corners, the Distortion World still behaves like a puzzle box, asking players to observe patterns, flip gravity, and move stones with quiet patience rather than panic. In the end, Giratina's home dimension is presented not as a horror maze, but as a controlled kind of weirdness, and are carefully built so that players can walk through the uncanny at their own pace, then leave when the story is done. And once players step back into Sinnoh's normal sky and grass, the series begins to experiment with other kinds of gentle extremes, including one region where the landscape itself seems to fold around ancient myths in a different, quieter way. After the strange folded spaces of Sinnoh and its distortion, the series briefly steps away from cosmic scale and instead focuses on something very small and very quiet. A single Pokémon walking at your side in Johto. Heart Gold and Soul Silver take the familiar routes and towns of Gold and Silver and add one gentle change that makes the world feel less like a map and more like a place. By letting your first party member step out of its Pokeball and trail behind you wherever players go. Did you know this simple following feature, which looks almost like a toy at first glance, is actually threaded with hundreds of tiny reactions and hidden lines of text, waiting for players who pause for just a moment instead of rushing to the next gym? The lead Pokémon does not only mirror your footsteps, it turns to face you when you stop, blinks in place on a quiet route, and occasionally hops or spins, as if it has noticed something that the game never fully explains. And sometimes it just says it is happy to be with you, and that is all. According to some, this was meant to echo the Pikachu that followed players in Pokémon Yellow, but Heart Gold and Soul Silver pushed the idea much further, tying it into the entire region. There are over 250 unique reaction lines buried in the script, triggered by different locations, weather, and story progress, meaning that many are seen once and then vanish into memory, if they are seen at all. You can stand by the sea in Olivine City, and your partner might gaze at the waves and relax, or on a stormy day it might flinch at distant thunder, even though no battle is happening and no cutscene starts. On the chilly paths near Ice Path, or in the snow around the Lake of Rage, some Pokémon are said to shiver slightly, described as huddling close or stamping their feet, while fire types might instead burn with determination, their bodies giving off comforting warmth. In the warm breeze of Route 39, a grass type can sway as if it is feeling the wind through leaves that are not really moving on screen. These are not big mechanics. There is no hidden stat boost here. They are just quiet acknowledgments that the same world affecting the player is brushing against the Pokémon as well. Even backtracking, which in many games feels like empty time, becomes a shared routine when the same partner has walked beside you for hours. The long walk from Ecruteak down to Goldenrod leads past trees players have already cut and trainers already defeated, turns into a small ritual where the only new thing is what your companion happens to say. This time, when you stop on an overlook or stand in front of a flower bed. One common rumor is that keeping a Pokémon out for the entire journey would secretly change its friendship faster. And although the rumors are false, the feeling behind them makes sense, because the game quietly trains players to read these tiny reactions as signs of a growing bond. In a series where so many myths focus on hidden power, strange glitches, or secret legendaries, this feature in Heart Gold and Soul Silver reinforces a different idea, that Pokémon are meant to feel like friends who travel with you, not just tools for battle or numbers in a box. The remakes use those hundreds of subtle lines to whisper that the world is shared, and later regions would keep chasing that feeling in new ways, from rotating seasons to Pokémon camping in the wild, as the journey slowly moves toward even larger, more open landscapes. As later regions tried new tricks to make Pokémon feel present beside players, Unova quietly changed the world itself, so that even if the game was left alone for a while, the region would not stay frozen in time. Did you know that in Black and White, the developers introduced a full seasonal system, not just a simple day and night cycle, but a rotation where the entire region shifted every in-game month, as if the land were breathing on its own. Instead of 4 seasons per real year, Unova cycles quickly, so spring, summer, autumn, and winter pass in a gentle loop, and each one slightly rewrites familiar routes. Grassy paths that seemed ordinary in summer might be coated in snow by winter, with drifts piling up along Route 7 and forming small ramps that let players reach ledges and items that are impossible in other months. While in autumn, the same road is lined with red and orange leaves that soften the ground and change the sound of footsteps. Some claimed that certain rare Pokémon would only appear if players waited for a specific seasonal combination of time and weather. And although the rumors are false in the most extreme versions, The core idea is true enough that the world begins to feel quietly conditional, as if it has moods. These visual changes are calm rather than dramatic, but they make a difference. In winter, icicles hang from signs, puddles freeze over, and the sky takes on a pale, washed tone. While in spring, melted snow reveals patches of green that had been hidden, as if the roots remember what was underneath. According to some, the soft crunch of snow in the overworld and the way the camera lingers a little longer on white fields made Unova feel almost like a different game. Even though players are walking the same paths, talking to the same NPCs and following the same story, the people change with the seasons as well. In Castelia City, Unova's sprawling metropolis, NPCs have different dialogue depending on the month. So a worker complaining about the heat in summer might instead talk about cold winds and early sunsets in winter, suggesting that they have quiet routines and private worries that continue whether players visit them or not. One common rumor is that if players checked every season for a full real-world year, some hidden character would acknowledge the dedication with a secret item or scene. However, this was easily debunked, though the seasonal lines themselves still create the feeling that the city has its own calendar and schedule. Castelia uses its crowds and narrow streets to sell a sense of scale that earlier regions could only hint at, with the camera pulling back to show high glass towers, tiny pedestrians, and boats sliding along the harbor. Yet even here there are tucked-away benches, piers, and back alleys where the noise drops and the music softens. Returning to those places in a different season feels a bit like checking in on an old neighborhood, finding that the trees have changed color, the regulars have new comments, and life has gone on quietly, without any need for players to be present. A small, steady reminder that the Pokémon world is designed to move forward on its own, even as later games experiment with camping, picnics, and larger open spaces that would stretch that illusion even further. From that sense of towns quietly continuing without players, Unova takes the idea a step further, building whole sequences around motion itself, so that even when nothing dramatic is happening, the world feels like it is gently gliding past, almost like scenery outside a train window late at night. In black and white, the battle subway and the ordinary trains beneath Nimbasa City turn this feeling into something concrete, with cars that sway in the background and tunnels that roll by in repeating patterns, giving the impression that the region is breathing in long, slow rhythms while players decide their next move. Did you know the battle subway platforms are some of the only places in the early series where the environment moves more than the camera does, with trains arriving, doors sliding open, and distant cars sliding away into darkness, while the player sprite stays perfectly still in the center of the frame. Some claimed that this made Unova feel more like a real metropolis than any previous region, because the motion suggested countless unseen passengers and Pokémon coming and going, each on their own timetable. And even though the battles inside are intense, the repeated departure chimes and soft mechanical hums can start to feel almost like white noise if players linger there. Above ground, the long bridge crossings turn that same idea of motion into something slower and more meditative, especially on Sky Arrow Bridge, which stretches between Pinwheel Forest and Castelia City. The game pulls the camera far back, then slowly sweeps it around as players run, walk, or simply stop, framing the Castelia skyline in the distance so that each step feels like approaching a postcard. And the only real sound is the steady footfall and the wind, a deliberate contrast to the crowded city that waits on the other side. According to some, the first time crossing Sky Arrow Bridge felt like entering a different kind of Pokémon game, because the camera does tricks that older handheld titles were never able to attempt, pivoting around the player, dipping low to look up at the arches, and then rising again to show tiny boats drifting along the water far below. One common rumor is that there are hidden events triggered by stopping at certain points or counting the number of bridge supports that pass by. But however this was easily debunked, the truth is that the bridge exists mainly as a quiet, unbroken walk, a place where the game invites players to do nothing except keep moving forward and watch the distance slowly close. Other Unova bridges, like Drift Vale Drawbridge and Marvelous Bridge, repeat that structure with different moods, adding flocks of winggull, falling feathers, or the faint outline of trucks and trains sliding by in the background. And the camera again adjusts just enough to sell the scale without becoming disorienting, as if the region is saying that it is vast, but not hostile. These areas tend to have almost no dialogue and very simple looping music, so moving across them feels like a lull between songs on a playlist, a subtle reset between story beats. And if players are already tired, the repetition can be strangely hypnotic, like rocking on a train late at night. Another rumor said that these quiet stretches hid secret encounters if crossed a certain number of times without stopping. And although the rumors are false, the idea fits the way these bridges and subways function, gently carrying players from one chapter to the next, which makes the sudden shift into the next busy location feel even sharper and sets up the next set piece where the environment itself starts to move in stranger ways than a simple train or bridge. After those long bridges and quiet subways, the game eventually lets players step out into something different, a place that feels less like a route and more like a heartbeat, pulsing at the center of an entire region. This is Lumiose City in Kalos, a circular hub where avenues stretch outward like spokes on a wheel, and where every street seems to promise another soft light, another side alley, another quiet detail waiting just off the main path. Inspired by Paris, Lumiose is built around a central plaza, anchored by the Prism Tower, with broad boulevards that curve away and reconnect, so that players can walk in slow circles and still feel as though they are moving forward. Cafes line the streets with tiny outdoor tables. Shops glow behind glass with signs and awnings, and narrow side streets slip between the larger avenues, hinting at corners that are easy to miss on a quick story playthrough. Did you know the city is one of the densest spaces in the series? Not in terms of battles or puzzles, but in terms of people just standing there, existing. Lumiose contains over 100 unique NPCs, scattered through restaurants, alleyways, plazas, and side corridors, and many of them only ever say a single line. Some claimed this was wasteful when the games were new, because players might talk to each of them once and never return. But that is exactly what makes the city feel crowded and lived in, even if the main story pushes forward at a brisk pace. A man at a cafe might comment on the weather. A woman near a boutique might briefly mention trends from another region, and a child by the taxi stand might talk about how big the city feels, then never speak again. According to some, there are still lines of flavor text in Lumiose that most players have never read, hidden behind doors that are easy to overlook, or buried in upper floors of buildings that do not contain any items or battles, only a single sentence. This rumor likely stems from how the city is structured, with its many near-identical facades and looping streets, making it hard to be certain that every room has been checked, every stranger spoken to. Although the rumors are false in the sense that the dialogue can all be found and cataloged, the feeling they describe is real, a sense that the city is larger than any single visit. What keeps all of this from feeling overwhelming is the atmosphere. The warm streetlights that come on as the in-game time shifts toward evening, throwing gentle circles of light onto the cobblestones, and the background music that trades excitement for a relaxed, almost late-night stroll feeling. The melody is steady and unhurried, with soft percussion that suggests footsteps on pavement rather than drums of battle. And when players slow down and simply walk, the city stops being a maze and becomes a quiet loop they can drift through. Kalos as a whole places a strong emphasis on style and beauty, and Lumios is where that philosophy is easiest to feel, not just in the fashion boutiques or the famous tower, but in these quiet details that barely affect the main story. The game rewards players who choose to wander without a goal, letting them find tiny conversations about food, art, travel, and Pokemon, so that the city feels like a place where people would still be talking even if the camera pulled away, preparing players for later Kalos locations, where that same attention to mood and detail shifts from cozy streets to more mysterious, out-of-the-way spaces. From there, Kalos quietly guides players away from busy streets toward places that feel older and more detached from the present. And one of the first is the Tower of Mastery, rising out of a cliffside like a pale stone lighthouse that watches the sea instead of guiding ships. Did you know the game never really explains every detail about this tower? Even though it is said to be tied to Mega Evolution and to ancient trainers who once trained alongside their Pokemon in total silence, listening to the waves below. As players walk up the long path, with the ocean stretching out on one side and the town falling away behind them, the rhythm of the game slows down, and inside the tower, statues of Lucario and old trainers stand perfectly still, their faces turned toward the center, as if waiting for something that no longer happens. Some claimed these statues hinted at forgotten megaforms or hidden battles, but the game only offers small clues. A mural here, a quiet line of dialogue there, an old man who said that humans and Pokemon have been training together for far longer than the modern league has existed. According to some, this kind of background detail makes the tower feel more like a shrine than a gameplay space, and the way the camera lingers on the sea during cutscenes adds to that feeling that players are standing in a place where countless battles once happened, but only the echoes remain. The murals along the walls show trainers reaching out to glowing Pokemon, suggesting early experiments with Mega Evolution. Yet the game never confirms who those people were or how many failed before the current method was discovered, leaving a gentle, unresolved mystery. A little later, Parfum Palace offers a different kind of history, trading cliffs and sea air for long hallways, polished floors, and sprawling gardens that seem to go on forever. Many said this area felt like the story almost stops, because the actual objective is simple and quickly resolved, while the real focus is on wandering past fountains, golden statues, and rows of hedges that have clearly been trimmed for generations, hinting at wealth and age that existed long before the player arrived. One common rumor is that there are secret items or hidden Pokemon tucked deep in the hedges, and although the rumors are false, the layout encourages players to search anyway. They're walking slowly along lantern-lit paths while the music softens and the palace windows glow in the distance. Then there is the optional fireworks scene, where the camera tilts up toward the sky and bright colors bloom above the palace roof, reflected in the fountains below, creating a calm emotional peak that many remember more vividly than some major battles. Another rumor said that certain choices in that scene could change future events. However, this was easily debunked, and the moment remains what it appears to be: a quiet pause where the game lets players simply watch the sky. Together, the Tower of Mastery and Parfum Palace suggest that every region has its own myths, ruins, and private histories, hinting that just beyond the roots and gyms, there are still older stories waiting, preparing players for later areas, where Kalos leans even further into forgotten weapons, ancient kings, and the long shadows they cast over the present. Kalos leans into those long shadows in a quieter way too, through a single encounter that many players still think about years later, even though it lasts only a few seconds. In Lumiose City, beyond the bright lights and busy streets, there is a small, ordinary-looking office building that hides one of X and Y's most understated myths. On one of the upper floors, if players step out of the elevator, the game suddenly takes control away for a moment, and a girl appears behind the protagonist without walking onto the screen, as if she has always been there. She glides forward in front of the player sprite without any footsteps. The music does not change, and nothing dramatic happens, yet the air feels slightly heavier. She simply says, "No, you're not the one," before moving past and fading away, leaving the floor as normal as any other Lumiose hallway. There is no battle, no spooky sound effect, and no follow-up quest marker. The building's NPCs go back to talking about mundane office life, as if nothing strange occurred, and players can ride the elevator up and down without ever seeing her again. For many, the first reaction was to wonder if this was a glitch, a half-loaded cutscene, or some kind of hidden story fragment that failed to trigger correctly. Did you know some claimed that talking to every NPC in Lumiose, or returning at a specific time, would cause her to reappear and finally explain herself? According to some, she was connected to the haunted house on Route 14, or to the strange empty hotel room where another NPC mentions a ghostly presence, creating a quiet network of rumors that Kalos was hiding a secret side quest. Another rumor said that if players visited the building with certain key items, or after beating the champion multiple times, the girl would acknowledge them and start a chain of events, though this was never proven. Data miners eventually combed through X and Y's scripts and event flags, looking for any leftover dialogue or conditions tied to her. However, this was easily debunked when no additional scenes or triggers were found. In the end, there is no official resolution inside X and Y, no confirmed identity, and no hidden reward. That absence of closure meant that the community quietly filled the gap, suggesting she might be a lost trainer, a reference to another region, or even a remnant of a scrapped storyline about Lumiose's power outages. One common rumor is that she was meant to tie into AZ's ancient war, or the ultimate weapon, but her role was cut back to a single encounter. Although the rumors are false, the moment itself is calm rather than frightening, almost like a passing thought that the game chooses not to elaborate on, and players can safely treat her as a small, contained mystery, rather than a source of fear. It shows how one silent NPC, or in a bright office with no jump scare, can echo through forums and videos for years, preparing players for later tales, where Kalos's legends blur even more between what is seen in-game and what is only whispered about outside the screen. After the quiet chill of Lumiose's hidden office, the series shifts to a region that almost feels like an antidote to unease, inviting players into a place where the nights are warm. The ocean is always nearby, and nearly every character seems to be in less of a hurry than in any other generation. In Alola, the game does not just tell players that life is slower. It builds an entire structure of play around that idea. Alola is arranged as 4 main islands and a smaller artificial one, each with its own trials, traditions, and local rhythm, loosely mirroring the way real-world Hawaii breaks into distinct yet connected communities. Melemele feels like a gentle starting shore. Akala stretches out with volcanic roots and long beaches. Ula Ula grows more rugged and storm-touched, and Pony Island almost fades into something ceremonial and ancient, so that moving between them feels less like rushing through regions and more like visiting different neighborhoods of the same long vacation. Instead of the hard, numbered order of gyms and badges, Alola replaces the standard formula with trials and island kahunas, and this small mechanical change creates a very different mood. Each trial captain acts more like a host than a challenger, setting up puzzles, scavenger hunts, or staged photo encounters that gradually lead to a totem Pokémon, while the kahunas preside like respected elders rather than simple boss fights. Progression starts to resemble a series of community festivals and rites of passage, and players are encouraged to see advancement as participating in local customs, rather than conquering a ladder. Did you know? Some claimed this structure made Alola feel less like a real league challenge, though in practice, it gives the story room to linger on families, neighbors, and shared meals. NPC dialogue is filled with small mentions of parents working late, cousins visiting from other islands, malasadas, and malasada shops, and characters who simply stand still to comment on the sunset or the breeze. According to some, this constant focus on food and relatives slows the pacing, but that slower pacing is exactly what lets late-night sessions in Alola feel like wandering through a sleepy town, rather than sprinting through an obstacle course. Visually, the region leans into that mood, with a warm color palette of gold light, soft pink skies, and deep blue water that almost glows during evening hours, while the soundscape layers in gentle waves, distant Wingull cries, and relaxed route themes that rarely feel urgent. One common rumor is that certain beaches hide secret events if players wait in one place long enough, watching the tide and listening to the surf. And even though the rumors are false, the idea fits the design. These routes are built to be strolled, not rushed. As players ride Lapras across calm coves or follow dimly lit paths under swaying palm trees, the game quietly encourages them to slow down, talk to bystanders, and notice tiny environmental details instead of racing from badge to badge. And this stands in soft contrast to regions that came before. The pattern almost inverts the usual challenge curve, as if the developers wanted at least one generation to feel like a long, late evening on the porch, before later games would return to harsher climates, steeper mountains, and rumors about regions shaped less by relaxation and more by conflict and history. And as Alola slows the pace of its journey, even the battles themselves start to feel different, because in Sun and Moon there is a quiet mechanic that turns random encounters into something that almost resembles watching a small ecosystem breathe. In these games, wild Pokémon can perform what the game calls an SOS call, and if a fight drags on long enough, the lone Pokémon in front of you may suddenly look upward, cry out, and summon an ally into battle, as if the grass or the sand or the cave around you has been listening the entire time. Did you know this is not just a difficulty feature, but a kind of subtle sketch of how Pokémon might look out for one another when players are not there to see it? Certain species are more likely to respond to each other, and according to some observations from players, the patterns begin to feel like implied neighborhoods, with Yungoos often calling other Yungoos on early routes, or a lone Corsola calling in Mariani, hinting at predator and prey relationships that the game never explains out loud. In lush patches of grass, you might see a chain of Bounsweet or Pikipek answering one another, while in drier fields, different Pokémon answer different cries, as if each habitat has its own unwritten rules. Some claimed that this system made Alola unfairly hard, because a simple battle could suddenly turn into a 2-on-1 endurance match, with one Pokémon attacking while the other raises stats or heals, and the encounter refusing to end as long as something new kept being called. However, this was easily debunked, as a true punishment once players realized how to manage it. And many eventually turned the SOS mechanic into a tool instead, using it to chain for shinies by repeatedly defeating one ally and letting another appear, over and over, in a loop that could last for an hour or more. For those who used it this way, the process became a patient, almost meditative hunt, with the same cry, the same animation, and the same species appearing again and again under the same sky, until the different colored Pokémon finally arrived like a quiet reward for persistence. One common rumor is that pressing buttons at the right time would increase the odds during these chains. But the reality is much simpler, with fixed shiny rates and bonuses that depend on how long the chain continues, rather than on hidden inputs, though players still said it felt as if the game somehow knew when they were paying attention. There is also a small emotional effect in seeing a wild Pokémon call for aid and then watching another appear, especially when the caller is weakened, poisoned, or nearly fainted, because the moment suggests that even out in the tall grass, Pokémon are not truly alone. The game never pauses to comment on this. There is no narrator explaining bonds or communities, but the mechanic itself becomes a kind of quiet storytelling, a reminder that roots and caves are shared spaces with their own invisible social ties, before later generations would experiment with other ways of showing Pokémon living together in the wild. In later generations, those invisible social ties in the grass are mirrored by something far stranger, as the series quietly opens doors to places that are not really roots at all, but whole other layers of reality. When Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon introduce Ultra Space and the Ultra Beasts, players are suddenly told that some Pokémon are not just rare or elusive, but genuinely foreign to the world they have been walking through since Pallet Town. Ultra Beasts are framed as Pokémon, yet also not quite Pokémon. Their names written with code-like identifiers, their shapes stretched and twisted in ways that feel slightly wrong next to a familiar Pikachu or Pidgey. Did you know that early interviews explained how their designs were meant to feel like something that wandered in from a different design document, with angles, proportions, and movements that did not match the usual rules, so that players would sense, even without reading the dialogue, that these creatures came from somewhere else? Some claimed that this meant Ultra Beasts were not canonically Pokémon at all. However, this was easily debunked by the games themselves, which quietly file them in the same Pokédex and let them share the same Pokéballs and mechanics. According to some, the first reveal of Nihilego or Buzzwole felt closer to a science fiction horror game than a traditional Pokémon title. Yet the tone in Alola never quite tips into fear. The Ultra Beasts might have unsettling glassy eyes or exaggerated muscles, but they still cry out with simple calls, still faint instead of dying, and still obey the same turn-based rhythm that has guided every battle since Red and Blue. Their alien nature is carefully framed, so that players feel curiosity first, and unease only as a faint echo. Ultra Space itself reinforces this mood by refusing to be chaotic. Instead of a frantic, glitchy void, most Ultra Wormhole destinations are calm, almost sterile dioramas. A floating island under a violet sky, a still desert of white sand, a canyon lit in a single color, where nothing moves unless players approach. The music is sparse, the sound design subdued, and the camera often pulls back, just enough that the space feels like a dream more than a battlefield. It is an unknown that waits politely. Once players learn that Ultra Beasts can be caught, nicknamed, and trained like any other partner, their intimidating stats and strange silhouettes soften, becoming part of the same quiet routine of throwing balls, checking summaries, and arranging teams. One common rumor is that using them in battle would lock in a bad ending or mark a save file in some hidden way. Though data miners later showed there was nothing like that lurking in the code, and the games themselves treat them as simply another branch on the ever-growing tree of species. Over time, then something that first appeared as a rupture in the setting becomes another comforting option in team building, another familiar entry on a list, echoing a pattern that runs through the whole series. The strangest corners of the Pokémon world become gentle once players understand how they work. The games quietly suggest that even the most alien visitor can fit into a Pokeball and a party slot, and that the unknown is just the future version of something that will one day feel ordinary, which makes the next layer of mystery the series hints at feel even more intriguing. By the time players reach the Galar region, the idea that strange places become ordinary, once understood quietly, shifts into something broader. As the games begin to ask what happens when the routes themselves open up and stop being straight lines. And this is where the wild area drifts into view like a low, grassy plain between towns. Instead of a narrow path with invisible walls, you step into a wide, bowl-shaped landscape that connects multiple cities and routes, and for the first time in a mainline game, the camera swings freely as you tilt the stick, letting you frame the horizon, the sky, and the wandering Pokémon however you like. Did you know some players said that first step out of the gate into the wild area felt almost wrong, as if the game had forgotten to close a fence somewhere, because there is no obvious corridor to follow, and no single patch of grass to hide every encounter. Herds of Pokémon stroll across the open field in full view, from small Squovit near the entrances to towering Onix that loom over the path. And instead of random battles, the creatures simply exist out there, grazing, circling, and occasionally glancing toward the player before moving on. The whole place feels like a connecting tissue between towns that accidentally became its own habitat. Weather is what quietly changes everything, though, turning the same hill into different moods depending on the day. On a clear afternoon, the wild area looks like a simple, sunlit park, with dust motes in the distance and Wingull drifting over the lake. But when rain rolls in, the ground darkens, puddles form, and different Pokémon appear, as if the region has decided to swap its cast. According to some players, the most calming moment is when a light mist settles in, softening the silhouettes of distant trees and dens, so the field feels half-remembered, like a rumor of a place instead of a map square. One common rumor is that certain rare Pokémon only spawn if the weather cycles through a specific pattern, while the player stays outside without entering a building. And although the rumors are false, the act of waiting and watching the sky change becomes its own quiet ritual. Small, unscripted moments happen when a curious Stuffle waddles up, or when a fast Pokémon suddenly decides to chase the player's bike, turning a lazy loop into a brief, harmless sprint before everything returns to normal. Many claimed they spent hours just biking around, collecting watts from glowing dens, circling the lake, and casually checking which beams were active. Not to complete a quest, but to enjoy a gentle loop of motion and sound. Another rumor said that the wild area was only a test, a prototype that slipped into the final game. However, this was easily debunked by later titles that expanded the idea into larger open zones, all built on the same quiet principle. Players move slowly, watch the land breathe, and let the Pokémon come to them. A design that Galar's first open field quietly introduced before the series pushed it even further in the next regions. After that slow wandering through Galar's first open field, the game offers an even quieter idea, almost hidden in plain sight on the menu, where players can stop moving entirely and still feel like the journey continues, just in a softer way. And that is the Pokemon Camp feature. Did you know, in Sword and Shield, instead of only resting at a formal building, players can unfold a tent almost anywhere in the wild area, or along a route, and the noisy world outside is replaced by a small circle of fabric, grass, and familiar faces. Once the tent is set up, your team does something the main story rarely allows, as Pokemon simply wander around, approach the camera, and wait to see what players will do, as if the adventure has been gently paused and everyone is catching their breath. The usual pressure of routes, trainers, and gym challenges fades, replaced by a kind of playable screensaver, where the most important choice is whether to call a partner over or just watch them trot past the campfire in slow, looping paths. Inside this space, the mechanics are intentionally low stakes, built around toys that would not feel out of place in a real campsite. You can pull out a rubber ball and toss it across the clearing, watching a Yamper sprint after it, or a Corviknight hop forward in a slightly awkward run. And there is no timer, no score, only the quiet repetition of throw and return. A feathered toy can be waved in front of a curious Pokemon, and some claimed that different motions would secretly raise hidden stats faster, though this was false, because the system is mainly there to raise friendship and create the feeling that these creatures are reacting to attention rather than to numbers. The other half of camp revolves around the cooking pot, where curry becomes a shared ritual instead of just another item in a bag. According to some early posts, perfectly timed stirring supposedly unlocked rare Pokemon or special forms. Another rumor said that fanning the flames in a precise rhythm would trigger secret dialogue. However, this was easily debunked, as the outcomes are limited to healing, experience, and a few visual flourishes. Still, the act of watching the ingredients fall in, stirring the shimmering surface, and fanning sparks into the night, turns a simple heal into a small domestic scene that plays out at the center of the tent. Around all of this, the sound design does quiet work, with soft background music, distant wind across the wild area, and the muffled calls of your team echoing just enough to feel close but not overwhelming, almost like a lullaby written for pixels and polygons. Moments like this show how some of the most memorable Pokemon memories are not the final battles or legendary encounters, but these optional pauses where nothing urgent is happening, and players are simply allowed to exist with their team before stepping back onto the road toward the next story rumor or mysterious location. From those quiet pauses with your team, players eventually reached a game that turned the pause into the main experience, stepping back in time to a region that would one day be called Sinnoh, but here went by another name, Hisui. In Legends, Arceus, the world feels like a half-remembered dream of Sinnoh, wide and mostly untouched, with only a few wooden settlements clinging to the edges of vast fields, frozen coasts, and fog-covered highlands where almost nothing man-made breaks the horizon. Instead of crowded cities and paved routes, there are long stretches of grassland where the wind moves in visible waves, small camps that feel temporary rather than permanent, and distant mountains that are not just background decoration, but looming shapes that players can quietly walk toward for minutes at a time. The game keeps reminding players that this is an earlier era, when Pokeballs are experimental tools. Jubilife Village is just a fragile cluster of buildings, and the idea of living alongside Pokemon is still treated as something risky, almost like a rumor that has not yet become normal life. Did you know the sound design in Hisui is intentionally muted, almost as if the world is holding its breath? There is music, but it often fades into long stretches, where all that remains are soft environmental noises, the crunch of boots on snow, the rustle of grass, the distant splash of a river, and the sudden, clear cry of a wild Pokémon cutting through the quiet like an ASMR trigger. According to some players, the most calming moments are not the battles or missions, but simply standing still near a pond at dusk, listening to Drifloon and Starly call out against the low hum of the wind. The core loop. In Legends, Arceus is also unusually simple and repetitive, in a way many found soothing. Sneak through the grass, watch a Pokemon's pattern, line up a throw, and listen for the soft click of the ball closing. Then repeat, again and again, across fields and marshes and icy slopes. There is danger, with Pokémon that can chase, attack, and even knock players out. However, the rhythm of crouching, observing, and catching quickly becomes almost meditative, like a quiet chore that players choose to keep doing long after the objective is complete. Instead of a Pokédex that fills with a single capture, Hisui asks for careful, repeated actions. See this Pokémon use a move 10 times, defeat it with a certain type, feed it, catch it without being seen. One common rumor is that this was only added to stretch out the game, though many who stayed with it said the small tasks felt oddly satisfying, as if every checked box was another tiny footprint, proving that Pokémon actually lived in this landscape. Watching a herd of Bidoof graze, throwing berries to a shy Petilil, or sitting on a hillside above a wandering group of Luxio, all become part of the research itself. Legends. Arceus quietly encourages players to stop chasing the waypoint and simply exist in Hisui for a while, to sit on a cliff and watch herds shift as the sun sets, to notice how the sky color changes before a time-space distortion appears in the distance. Some claimed that just resting at a campfire and listening to the night sounds was more relaxing than finishing the main story. And although the rumors are false that certain Pokémon only appear if players remain idle for an hour without moving, the game almost makes that idea feel believable. After all, if an older Sinnoh can feel this different, what other regions might hide gentler versions of themselves, waiting in the background of later games for players to discover them in unexpected ways? In a way, that idea leads naturally into Paldea, where the region itself is built around the feeling that the quieter version of the journey is finally the main story, and not just something hiding in the background. Scarlet and Violet place players at the center of a sprawling academy, a single huge school that becomes a kind of campus town, with classrooms, dorms, and clubs, arranged like a small city where every hallway feels like it could hide a calm, personal moment. The Central Academy functions as a home base more than a traditional Pokémon League hub. And did you know some players even described it as feeling closer to a school-life anime than a standard RPG? Lecture rooms are filled with teachers who remember faces. Dorm rooms can be decorated and revisited. And the language, history, and battle classes quietly reward curiosity instead of raw strength. So simply sitting through lessons and talking to classmates becomes part of the adventure rather than a distraction from it. Instead of constant world-ending threats, many of Paldea's side quests focus on helping other students with small, almost mundane problems. And this rumor likely stems from the way older games often tied side events to legendary Pokémon or dangerous glitches. Some claimed the Academy would eventually reveal a hidden, apocalyptic storyline. However, this was easily debunked once players realized that most requests involve things like locating a lost item, cheering up a lonely teacher, or helping a nervous trainer feel confident enough to battle outside the school grounds. According to some, the most unusual detail is how freely players can leave that campus behind, because Paldea's open world can be explored in almost any order, with gym leaders, Titan Pokémon, Turin Team Star bases arranged like gentle suggestions instead of locked checkpoints. One common rumor is that there is a correct route through the region that secretly maximizes story impact, though the games quietly reward those who wander, letting lower-level Pokémon appear beside high cliffs and letting stronger teams wait patiently at the far edges of the map. Out in the countryside, Paldea is dotted with quiet corners that almost feel designed for those who like to put the controller down and just listen. Lakesides in the far north ripple under slow, looping music. Windmills turn on distant hills, while flocks of small Pokémon circle lazily overhead, and tiny towns sit between fields of wheat and olive trees, their Pokémon centers casting a soft glow that reflects on the stone streets at night. There is even a subtle pattern interrupt in how the game treats progress, because instead of forcing players toward the champion's path, it lets them linger on hilltops, watch flocks migrate across the sky, or stand at the edge of a cliff and wait as the sun sets over the sea. In that structure, the Paldea journey suggests that growing up in the Pokémon world does not have to mean racing toward the strongest opponents. It can also mean drifting between classes and quiet roads at a personal pace, turning the region into a calm or open notebook where every unhurried step still counts as moving forward. From that kind of slow wandering, it becomes easier to notice that the towns themselves are quietly changing around players, as if the regions keep breathing, whether anyone is holding a controller or not. Did you know that in several games, background NPCs mention events from earlier titles, speaking about them as distant history rather than game features, as though other trainers once passed through and then simply moved on? In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, an elderly man in Kanto talks about the young trainer who once toppled Team Rocket, clearly referring to the red and blue protagonist. And in Black and White, Unova citizens mentioned the distant Kanto and Johto regions as places where unusual Pokémon incidents occurred, turning earlier storylines into rumors inside the world itself. According to some players, this made the games feel faintly haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of previous save files and adventures that are never shown, only hinted at in quiet conversations. Other details are even smaller, tucked into corners that most will never inspect closely. In early towns in Ruby and Sapphire, laundry hangs behind houses on tiny pixel clotheslines, suggesting that someone washed their everyday clothes while players rush toward the next gym. In Diamond and Pearl, bicycles rest against walls outside homes in Orberg and Hearthome, and if players stop long enough to read the nearby signs, they often find flavor text that simply describes the smell of flowers, the sound of machinery, or how a child once fell off that very bike and cried until a Pokémon Center nurse comforted them. These signs almost never affect progress, and though they quietly reinforce a recurring motif that runs through the series, technology and nature coexisting in the same fragile space. In multiple regions, televisions talk about cutting-edge Pokeball research, while, just outside the window, flowers sway in looping animations. And in Kalos and Galar, computers sit beside potted plants and wooden bookshelves, as if the games are gently reminding players that laboratories and forests, steel bridges and grassy roots, are meant to share the same frame. Developers have occasionally mentioned in interviews that many of these touches are added with full awareness that only a fraction of players will ever notice them, and some claimed that this is precisely the point. These details are not there to be collected like hidden items. Instead, they sit in the background like faint, optional memories, ready to reward anyone who slows down long enough to look at a back fence, a rooftop antenna, or a forgotten bench facing the sea. Although the rumors are false that every town hides a secret event, if players just press A on the right tile. The truth is quieter and perhaps more comforting. The towns already hide something. Unremarkable, ordinary life. As the story moves on in the foreground, those hanging shirts, parked bikes, and idle NPC conversations remain, and players could at any time imagine revisiting old regions at a walking pace, listening for the hum of machines beside the wind in the grass, and treating each familiar town like a place that has been quietly waiting in the dark between play sessions for someone to notice its smallest, sleepiest details. In those quiet towns that feel like they are waiting in the dark, there are also people whose stories move just as slowly as the wind through the grass. And if players take the time to talk to them more than once, entire little arcs unfold between battles without any fanfare at all. Did you know many of these NPC stories change only a single line at a time? So gently that some never noticed they were watching a character grow up alongside their own journey. One common example is the recurring traveler pairs that appear in multiple locations across a region. Sometimes as an arguing couple, sometimes as nervous friends, sometimes as an aspiring trainer and their partner who cannot quite keep up. In Hoenn, Sinnoh, and later regions, some claimed that if players spoke to every appearance of these duos, they would unlock a hidden item or even a secret double battle. However, this was easily debunked, and the only real reward is hearing that their trip went well, or that they finally gathered the courage to challenge a gym together. The story still feels complete, even if the game never announces it. There are also lonelier tales, like the man in certain games who stands in a harbor town, waiting for a lover who never arrives. His dialogue changing as days and story events pass, shifting from confident promises to quieter, almost resigned hope. Another rumor said that talking to him after defeating the champion would trigger a reunion cutscene. But although the rumors are false, the emotional effect of seeing him still waiting, unchanged, can linger in the background of later visits. The game never confirms whether his story ends happily. It simply lets players carry that question with them. Other arcs are gentler, such as the shy child who wants to be a trainer but is afraid of Pokemon battles, or the youngster who loses every time and keeps adjusting their team. According to some early guides, giving these characters certain items would drastically improve their strength, but in reality, the most that usually happens is a small boost in confidence, a new line of dialogue, or a slightly better team when players meet them again. The prize is not a rare held item. It is the sense that someone listened to them, even in a world of legendary Pokemon and cosmic threats. These stories rarely give more than a minor item, a decoration, or a brief thank you. And yet, they can make a region feel less like a checklist of gyms and more like a place full of parallel lives, all moving at their own pace just off the main path. When players notice this, the Pokemon world starts to feel like a quiet apartment building at night with different lights turning on and off behind thin walls, each room holding its own struggles and small joys that do not depend on the player at all. Some claimed that if every one of these tiny arcs was completed, a hidden NPC somewhere would acknowledge that the whole region had changed. But this rumor likely stems from the feeling that something must connect all these threads. After all, if so many side stories are hiding in plain sight, what else might be woven into the background, waiting for someone half awake to notice a final, almost invisible detail in the next town over? Once players step back from chasing those invisible threads, the game quietly offers a different kind of mystery in plain sight. The Pokédex itself, a long, scrolling collection of tiny stories that pretend to be dry research notes, yet read almost like fragments of a bedtime bestiary. Each entry is written as if some in-universe scholar stood at a distance with a notebook, or traveled alongside a trainer, and wrote down what was seen, what was heard, and according to some, what was only rumored. Did you know that many of the calmest entries sound almost like gentle travel guides, describing how certain Pokemon behave when the world is quiet and no one is rushing to battle? There are Pokemon said to guide lost travelers through forests by softly glowing, or by calling out at crossroads when the fog is thick, giving players the image of a companion that appears only when needed. Others are described as warming people, with their fur on cold nights, or sharing berries and food with their trainers, turning what could have been combat data into small scenes of companionship and routine. Some entries even feel like they are reassuring players that the world is safe to fall asleep in, mentioning Pokemon that stand guard while their trainers rest, or that become calmer when they sense peaceful emotions nearby. One common rumor is that the friendlier-sounding entries secretly reflect how attached a Pokemon is to its trainer, though this is false in terms of actual game mechanics. It still fits the way many players imagine their teams quietly interacting off-screen. However, right next to these cozy notes, the series also places stranger lines that sound more like campfire folklore than field reports. Ghost-type Pokemon, in particular, are often said to steal warmth, follow children, or even play with spirits. Yet the wording tends to be just vague enough that it feels like a story being passed down, rather than a warning. Another rumor said that some of the most unsettling entries, like those mentioning lost souls or disappearances, were toned down from even darker drafts, but this was easily debunked by comparisons with the original Japanese text, which already reads more like stylized myth than direct horror. Over time, as generations changed, the Pokédex quietly changed with them, and players could see that knowledge inside the world was not fixed either. A Pokémon that was once described only as mysterious might later receive a new entry explaining its diet, its migration pattern, or how it behaves in cities, as if researchers had gone back into the field, taken more notes, and updated the record. Some claimed that this meant the earlier entries were mistakes, but it also mirrors how real-world science shifts when new observations appear, turning the Pokédex into a slow, in-universe conversation between games. Reading through all of these, from the softest to the faintly eerie, can feel less like consulting a database and more like flipping through a storybook in the dark. Each page offering a single paragraph about a strange creature that lives by its own rules. It is calm, yet a little odd, and just uncertain enough that players might wonder what the next entry will say, which leads naturally into the other ways Pokemon games hide their lore in plain sight, not in text boxes, but in the environments and background details that surround those creatures wherever they appear. From those quiet, unsettling Pokédex lines, players can drift out even further and look at the shapes of the creatures themselves. Because did you know many Pokemon are built from things so familiar that the designs almost disappear into the background of your memory? The series returns again and again to simple animals, turning cats, dogs, birds, and fish into companions with rounder faces, larger eyes, and softer colors so they feel calm and expressive, rather than threatening. So a basic house cat idea becomes Meowth or Skitty, and an ordinary goldfish is stretched into Magikarp, or later into the elegant, drifting Melodic. In every region, there is a bird that could sit quietly on a telephone wire in the real world, from Pidgey to Starly to Fletchling. Yet each one is pushed just far enough that players would recognize it as a Pokemon and not a field guide illustration, with wings, markings, and tiny gestures that suggest personality without needing dialogue. Even many canine Pokemon follow this pattern, with Growlithe, Yamper, and Rockruff all echoing familiar pet silhouettes, almost like the games are gently asking players to project their own memories of real animals onto these stylized shapes. Beneath that comforting layer of pets and wildlife, the series hides another tradition, tying designs to myths and legends in ways that are often only half explained in the games themselves. Some claimed the legendary beasts in Johto were just fantasy animals. However, this was easily debunked, as interviews clarified that Raikou, Entei, and Suicune were shaped by a mixture of big cats, guardian statues, and storm deities, while Ho-Oh and Lugia echo long-bodied eastern dragons and western holy birds at the same time. According to some early design notes, creatures like Ninetales and Froslass pulled directly from Japanese yokai stories, while others, such as the Tapu Guardians of Alola, blend island deities and protective spirits into masks and shells that feel ceremonial rather than aggressive. Then there is the quieter, stranger category, Pokemon based on everyday objects that players might have within arm's reach while listening to this. A key ring becomes Klefki, a chipped teapot turns into Poltergeist, and a simple candle is stretched into Litwick. Its flame and wax made just eerie enough to stand out, but still small and contained, like a nightlight in a dark room. One common rumor is that these object-based designs were a late, desperate idea when the artists ran out of animals, so though this rumor likely stems from players noticing them more in later generations. In reality, faces have been placed on objects since the very first games, with Magnemite and Voltorb quietly proving the concept. Some designs even stack multiple influences, mixing regional animals with local myths from the real-world countries that inspired each region. So Galar's Corviknight feels like both a real crow and a medieval knight, while Paldea's creatures draw from Iberian lizards, dancers, and folk tales at once. Over time, all of these inspirations form a patchwork, turning Pokemon into a soft collage of global stories where nothing is copied directly and everything is filtered through the same gentle, rounded art style, which leads naturally into how the regions themselves borrow real landscapes and cities, then smooth out the edges so players can wander through a dreamlike version of the world. So as the regions turn real mountains and cities into softened, dreamlike maps, individual Pokemon can also feel like tiny dreams that slipped into the code, and one of the quietest examples of this is the idea of shiny Pokemon, those almost secret, alternate-colored versions that only appear once in a great while. In battle, they arrive with a small sparkle animation, not loud or dramatic, just a brief glimmer. And then they stand there, in a slightly different hue, as if the game is asking players whether they are really seeing what they think they are seeing. Did you know that in the earliest games that included them, the odds of finding a shiny in the wild were set at an almost absurd one, an 8,192 chance, meaning that players could walk through grass for months and never see one, yet every single encounter still technically held that possibility. Some claimed that pressing certain buttons, restarting at specific times of day, or battling in certain patches of grass would help. But unlike catch rate button myths, this was not about tricking the game's formulas, just about waiting long enough for a rare roll to happen. According to some, the first time a wild shiny appeared, there was a moment of disbelief because the sprite looked wrong, almost like a glitch, until the sparkle effect confirmed that this was intentional. As generations continued, developers slowly added methods that gently bent the odds without ever removing the basic idea that shinies are improbable visitors. The Masuda method, named after director Junichi Masuda, quietly increased shiny chances when players bred two Pokémon from games in different languages, turning international trading into a calm, behind-the-scenes collaboration. Later titles introduced chain fishing, where casting the rod in the same spot and never missing a bite would raise the odds, and SOS chaining, where repeatedly battling the allies called in by a wild Pokémon would do the same, turning a normal encounter into a soft, looping routine. One common rumor is that breaking concentration for even a moment ruins everything. But in truth, these systems are just gentle multipliers, not fragile spells. For many players, shiny hunting becomes a kind of meditative background ritual, a pattern of inputs repeated hundreds or even thousands of times while music plays, or a show runs quietly in another window. The mind drifts, the hands follow the same steps, and the grass rustles again and again. Each encounter, statistically identical, yet emotionally different, because any one of them could be the one that finally flashes with that muted shimmer. When a shiny finally appears, it is rarely about power, since most of them are no stronger than their regular counterparts. Instead, the feeling is a small, private confirmation that patience can be rewarded by something the game never promises outright. Even if players have never seen a shiny on their own save file, just knowing that the code is always rolling, that hidden die adds a faint layer of magic to every root, cave, and patch of water. Every Zubat, every Magikarp, every Pidgey in the starting grass carries that same remote chance, turning routine grinding into a quiet lottery that never quite ends. And this rumor of possibility lingers in the background of the entire series, which leads naturally into another invisible system that shapes how rare and common Pokémon move through the world, and how players once tried to bend those odds in stranger ways. In the same way that every random encounter hides invisible odds, the act of creating new Pokémon in the games is also guided by quiet numbers and unseen checks, all happening off-screen, while players go about their journey. And did you know that for many, this hidden system becomes its own calm ritual? When compatible Pokémon are left together at the daycare or nursery, nothing dramatic appears to happen at first. The screen does not flash. There is no cutscene. Just the knowledge that somewhere in the background, steps are being counted, and a hidden counter is slowly ticking toward an egg. The species that eventually appears in that egg is usually determined by the mother, or by whichever parent is not a Ditto. So a simple choice of which Pokémon to leave behind quietly decides what will hatch later, even if players have already walked far away. Moves and stats are influenced as well, with the game checking each parent's moveset and hidden values, then blending them in a way that feels natural in battle, but is actually the result of careful internal rules that most players never see spelled out. Some claimed that pressing buttons during the hatching animation could change these outcomes. But however, this was easily debunked by data miners who showed that everything is decided long before the egg even cracks. Within this system, certain attacks exist as so-called egg moves, techniques that a Pokémon could never learn by level up or TM in that generation, but that appear if a compatible parent already knows them, turning breeding into a kind of quiet inheritance. According to some early guides, players needed to follow extremely specific chains, pairing one Pokémon with another, across multiple generations, just to pass a single move like Dragon Dance or Wish. And while the exact routes can be complex, the result is a custom moveset that feels almost like a secret message passed down through a family line. Hidden values, such as IVs and even abilities in later games, can also be nudged and shaped through breeding, with items like the Destiny Knot and Everstone, acting as subtle tools that tilt the odds in a player's favor, without ever guaranteeing perfection. This is why many players spend hours calmly cycling back and forth in front of a daycare, or around an oval track in Kalos, or in tight circles by a nursery in Galar, letting the scenery loop while a growing stack of eggs fills their party. One common rumor is that certain tiles on these loops hatch Pokémon faster, but those claims are false, as the only thing that truly matters is the number of steps. There is something quietly soothing about riding a bike in circles, hearing the soft chime that signals an egg is ready, then later watching the hatching animation repeat, with only small variations in color, nature, or ability, like waves breaking on the same shore. Behind almost every strong competitive Pokémon, there may be a long, silent history of breeding and hatching that most players never witness, a lineage of discarded siblings and carefully chosen parents, all condensed into one final partner that steps onto the battlefield as if it simply appeared that way. And just as breeding turns patient repetition into hidden strength, another background system takes that same idea and stretches it across entire regions, quietly tracking friendships, loyalties, and bonds that change how Pokémon fight and evolve, even when no one is watching. That quiet system of hidden bonds has a soundtrack too. And for many players, the music is what makes those invisible connections feel real, even years later, when the screen is long gone and only a few notes remain in memory. Did you know one of the most powerful examples is also one of the shortest pieces of music in the entire series? The Pokémon Center healing jingle. Across generations, that tiny melody barely changes, just a handful of notes that rise and fall in a simple, comforting pattern, short enough to fit on the earliest Game Boy hardware, and reusable enough that it could follow players from Kanto all the way to Paldea without ever feeling out of place, where composers have described how keeping it brief and immediately recognizable turns it into a kind of auditory hug, a sound that tells you your team is safe, the battle is over, and nothing bad can happen while that chime is playing in the background. Outside the cities, longer themes quietly take over that same role, especially the calm route music that many players now use as background noise for studying, working, or falling asleep. Route 1 in Kanto, with its gentle, stepping melody and soft repeating phrases, became a kind of musical shorthand for beginning a journey, while Johto's Route 29 adds a slightly more wistful tone, looping in a way that could run for hours without feeling demanding. According to some, Hoenn's Route 113 and Sinnoh's Route 201 are perfect examples of how a simple pattern, repeated with tiny variations, can feel like walking the same path at dusk over and over. Each region's soundtrack leans on different instruments and motifs to sell its personality, even when the hardware is only suggesting those sounds through chiptune. Johto often uses pentatonic lines and bell-like tones to create a traditional, almost historical feeling, as if the roots have existed for centuries. Hoenn's themes add brighter synths and more energetic rhythms that still manage to feel mellow when played quietly, while Sinnoh leans into piano and soft strings. You're giving snowy areas and lakes a colder, crystalline calm. In Alola, ukulele-like strums and relaxed percussion create a tropical warmth, so even a simple route theme can feel like a late evening walk near the ocean. Underneath that surface, composers also use subtle key changes and tempo shifts to mark time and story progression without drawing attention away from the player's thoughts. One common rumor is that these changes were only added for technical reasons, but in practice they act like a clock, with slower, softer night versions in games like Gold and Silver, or Diamond and Pearl, gently signaling that the world has settled down. Another rumor said that certain routes would secretly speed up if a major plot event was about to happen. However, this was easily debunked, and most tempo changes are simply tied to location or time of day. Even now, a few notes from a Pokemon Center, a calm route, or a town at night can pull many players straight back to quiet childhood evenings, handheld screens glowing in dark rooms, the looped music filling the silence while the rest of the house slept. As the series moved forward, that idea of music as a soft signal of safety and mystery would only grow, shaping not just routes and cities, but eerie ruins, abandoned buildings, and places where rumors gathered around the soundtrack itself. As that music quietly loops in the background, another layer of the game sits just out of sight. Not in the soundtrack this time, but in the code itself, where half-finished ideas and abandoned paths still sleep. During development, creators always plan more than can fit into a cartridge, so entire features, maps, and even early Pokemon designs end up left behind, their data tucked away where players never normally go. Did you know that in almost every generation, unused sprites and early concept versions of familiar Pokemon have been found, showing slightly stranger proportions, different colors, or expressions that feel a little more serious than the ones that finally shipped? Some claimed that these hidden designs proved there were secret forms waiting to be unlocked. However, this was easily debunked once developers explained that they were simply drafts, snapshots from a time when nothing was final and any creature could still change shape. In that sense, the Pokemon players know are just the last version of a long, quiet conversation behind the scenes. Inside the game data, there are also beta maps and test rooms, blank grids, early towns, and alternate route layouts that suggest regions once stretched in different directions, with extra caves, side paths, or buildings that never made it to the finished world. According to some early rumors, these empty areas were proof of hidden post-game islands or scrapped story chapters, though data miners later showed they were mostly development leftovers, used to test movement, battles, or tiles before the real maps were built. Still, when players see a half-finished town or a route that suddenly stops at a cliff, it feels like looking at a dream that the region almost had. Fans uncover these fragments by patiently combing through the code, frame by frame and file by file, treating the game like an archaeological site, rather than just a place to battle in. The one common rumor is that developers secretly leave these pieces behind as messages to dedicated players, but in reality, they are usually just remnants that were never fully cleaned out. Technical ghosts that stayed because removing them might have caused more trouble than leaving them. Even so, players like to imagine what the adventure would have felt like if that unused building had been a shop, or if that blocked cave had led to a small, hidden valley with its own quiet music. Some of these cut ideas do not stay buried forever. Over time, designs that were once rejected are refined and reappear in later generations. Mechanics that were too ambitious for older hardware return, in softer, more polished forms, and concepts hinted at only in unused text boxes eventually show up as full features. It can feel as though the series remembers its own what-ifs and gently recycles them, turning old rumors into new realities. In that way, the code holds a parallel Pokemon world made of unfinished thoughts, alternate region shapes, and slightly different faces, like a stack of faint sketches beneath a final drawing. And the next secrets come from places where those sketches accidentally touched the versions players actually received. Those faint sketches under the finished game did not just live in the code. They also lived in the stories players told each other, especially on playgrounds and bus rides, where every gap in understanding turned into a schoolyard rumor waiting to be believed. In those quieter spaces between classes, the Pokemon world seemed to spill out of the cartridge and into whispered instructions and half-remembered tricks. One common rumor is that pressing certain buttons at just the right moment could bend the odds in a player's favor, almost like casting a small spell over the Game Boy screen. Some claimed that holding down and B the instant a Pokeball closed would increase the catch rate, while others said that tapping A in a steady rhythm, or alternating A and B as the ball shook, could convince the Pokemon to stay inside. According to some, even releasing the buttons at the exact frame before the final click was supposed to matter, though none of these inputs changed the underlying math in the code. Another rumor said that secret Pokemon waited just beyond impossible milestones, as if the game were quietly testing the most dedicated players. Children would repeat that beating the Elite Four 100 times without losing would unlock a hidden starter, or that reaching level 100 with an entire party of the same species would cause a new evolution to appear in the grass outside Pallet Town. Others claimed that talking to every NPC in the region in a single in-game day would trigger a mysterious encounter, a kind of invisible quest line that only the most patient players would ever see. Did you know many of these tales grew from the same simple truth, that official information was scarce and slow, especially for younger players without guides or reliable internet access, so the empty spaces around the known mechanics felt like open land. When a rare event, a strange glitch, or an unusual NPC line appeared, it was easy to imagine there was more just out of sight, and each rumor built a bridge to that unseen territory. This rumor likely stems from the natural way children test boundaries, turning guesswork into confident instructions that sound just plausible enough to try. Trading these stories at recess or on long car rides made the Pokemon world feel wider than the cartridge's actual limits, as if there were endless hidden layers tucked behind familiar routes and menus. Even when repeated rituals failed, the act of trying them together, taking turns with the same save file or passing the handheld around, created a quiet sense of community, and the game became a shared map of what might be true. Most of these claims were false, and many were eventually disproven by data miners and official guides. However, this was easily debunked, rarely erased the gentle thrill of believing, or of wondering if a friend's cousin really had seen something impossible on a late-night play session. Although the rumors are false, remembering them now can feel strangely comforting, like recalling a shared dream that many players had at once. And the next myths would move from schoolyards into message boards and early fan sites, where that same imagination found new ways to hide Pokemon just out of reach. From there, the rumors began to lean into something darker, as early message boards and fan sites started trading not just secret Pokemon, but full-on ghost stories about the games themselves, the kind of tales players might half believe when staring at a dim screen in a quiet room. Did you know some of the most famous involve Lavender Town, haunted cartridges, and episodes of the anime that were said to be too disturbing to ever air? One common rumor is that the original Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town hid a secret boss called Buried Alive, a corpse-like trainer waiting at the top floor who would drag the player into the ground if they lost. According to some versions, the screen would freeze on a realistic image of hands pulling the player down, followed by corrupted text and a reset that erased the save file. However, this was easily debunked, because no version of Red, Green, or Blue contains data for such a fight, and the story can be traced back to fan fiction that was openly posted as horror writing. Another rumor said that certain cartridges were haunted, usually described as old copies of Pokemon Red or a mysterious Pokemon Black, where the player traveled with a ghostly companion that could curse NPCs. Some claim the game would become more violent over time, with the ghost eventually turning on the player, and the final scene supposedly locking the screen on a graveyard filled with every Pokemon and trainer name used. Though the descriptions can sound unsettling, careful digging shows these haunted cartridge stories began as creepypastas, written like campfire tales that simply borrowed the familiar visuals of the Game Boy era. Lost episodes were pulled into this same style of rumor, with players repeating claims about a banned Lavender Town anime episode that made viewers sick, or a version of the Cubone story that was said to show graphic scenes. In reality, while the anime has had a few episodes pulled or edited for reasons like flashing lights or cultural sensitivity, no official Pokémon game or show includes the kind of explicit horror described in these myths, and those details are part of internet storytelling rather than hidden content on a cartridge. These rumors caught on because the games already had a few gently eerie spaces, like the detuned music of Lavender Town, the lonely hallways of Pokémon Tower, or the quiet, abandoned buildings in later regions, and players' imaginations did the rest. This rumor likely stems from that contrast between cute sprites and ghost-type lore, where writers wanted to explore what might be lurking just beyond what the screen actually shows. Although the rumors are false, they can be reframed as modern ghost stories told around the glow of a Game Boy screen, and the next myths would shift back toward less frightening territory, focusing again on hidden mechanics, secret items, and the quieter mysteries that still kept players talking late into the night. After all those eerie ghost stories about things hiding just off-screen, it is almost calming to notice how much of Pokémon's design is quietly working in the background to make sure players feel comfortable instead of punished, even if most never stop to think about it. Did you know that by the later generations, almost every menu, icon, and sound has been tuned so gently that it fades into the edge of awareness, guiding decisions without demanding attention? In the earliest games, move names and types were just text, so players had to memorize that Thunder Punch was electric, or that Swift was normal, and mistakes were common in the middle of a long battle. Over time, tiny type icons appeared next to each attack, then color-coded labels, so a quick glance at a patch of blue or green told players what they needed to know, even half awake at midnight. The same happened to the main menus, with bag pockets and party screens shaded and organized, turning what used to feel like a list of words into something closer to a familiar layout that hands could navigate almost on their own. Another subtle change sits in the way the cursor behaves. In older titles, every time players opened a shop or a Pokémon Center PC, the selector would snap back to the top, asking for constant little corrections. Later games remember the last item bought, the last box opened, or the last move highlighted. So the next time the menu appears, the cursor is already resting, where players are most likely to need it. Each individual moment saves only a second, however. Those seconds add up across hundreds of battles and box trips, smoothing away a kind of friction that many only notice when returning to an earlier generation. The PC itself also evolved from a clunky, text-heavy system into something closer to a quiet assistant. Drag-and-drop box management, automatic sending of caught Pokémon to the next open slot, and even quick search filters for species, types, or held items all appeared bit by bit. According to some developer interviews, many of these changes were direct responses to feedback that organizing a living Pokédex felt more like office work than adventure. So the interface was slowly reshaped until it felt almost invisible. Beyond menus, the games began adding small conveniences that changed the rhythm of play. Automatic exp share features meant that raising a full party no longer required grinding the same wild patch for hours while swapping the weakest Pokémon in and out of the lead slot. Reusable TMs removed the old tension of whether a powerful move should be saved forever. And Move Reminder, NPCs allowed players to fix mistakes or experiment without starting over. Some claimed these changes made the series easier. Another rumor said that they ruined the challenge. However, this was easily debunked by the fact that optional difficulty still exists in battle facilities, competitive formats, and self-imposed rules. The core adventures simply became less about paperwork and more about exploring. Taken together, these quiet quality-of-life touches show an ongoing, almost whispered dialogue between fans and developers, where complaints about tedium slowly transformed into invisible comforts that make the world feel welcoming to both new and returning players. And as the series kept listening, the next set of myths would not be about hidden menus at all, but about the strange new ways Pokémon themselves could appear, vanish, or change shape in front of players' eyes. As those shifting forms and hidden mechanics took shape, another quieter pattern emerged in the series, one that did not involve strange new evolutions at all, but the simple act of returning to places players already knew by heart. Did you know it, for many, the most mysterious feeling in Pokémon is not discovering a new region, but stepping back into an old one that has been carefully rebuilt, like a dream retold years later with clearer details. When Fire Red and Leaf Green brought Kanto onto the Game Boy Advance, now players could walk the same routes from Pallet Town to the Indigo Plateau, yet every sprite, every patch of grass, and every battle animation had been redrawn, as if someone had quietly dusted off a childhood memory and placed it under gentler light. Heart Gold and Soul Silver did the same for Johto, letting your lead Pokémon follow behind you, turning that familiar journey past Cherry Grove and Violet City into something warmer and more companion-like. While Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl reimagined Sinnoh with softer, toy-like models that some claimed made even cold places, like Snow Point City, feel almost like a diorama on a bedroom shelf. The music in these remakes is often where the feeling becomes most noticeable, because you walk down Route 1 or onto the cycling road and hear an arrangement that is almost the same, yet changed. According to some, it feels like hearing a lullaby from childhood played on different instruments, where the melody is intact, but the texture is thicker, the drums a little fuller, the flutes and strings smoothing out the harshness of early sound chips. One common rumor is that certain tracks hide fragments of their original sound fonts deep in the mix, though this was easily debunked. The comfort comes not from secret samples, but from careful rearrangement that lets players recognize every phrase while still feeling that time has passed. Remakes rarely stop at visuals and audio, though, and this is where the revisits become layered rather than simple copies. Fire Red and Leaf Green quietly added the CV Islands, remote outposts that expanded Kanto's map just enough to feel like a new chapter appended to a familiar book, while Heart Gold and Soul Silver slipped in the Sinjoh Ruins event, connecting Johto and Sinnoh with a strange ancient space that deepened the lore around Arceus and creation myths. Even Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which many said were strict retellings, tucked in features like Romana's Park, a redesigned Pal Park that turned legendary encounters into a kind of quiet pilgrimage. For many players, these games become a bridge between childhood and whatever stage of life they are in now, because returning to Kanto or Johto on a newer system means carrying very old, save file memories into a present-day routine of work, study, or late-night rest. The roots are the same. The gym leaders say almost the same lines, but the hardware, the controllers, and the person holding them have all changed, creating a layered nostalgia that feels strangely grounding. In that sense, replaying a Pokémon remake can act like a form of self-soothing, a way to anchor the mind in something stable and kind, where the rules are known and the dangers are gentle. Some claimed that constantly going back to the same region was a sign of the series refusing to move on. Although the rumors are false, the truth is quieter, because these revisits function more like a soft place to land between stranger experiments. And as the series continued to alternate between brand new regions and careful returns, the next myths that formed would not be about old maps at all, but about rare colors, unusual odds, and the subtle sparkle of Pokémon that looked almost the same, yet just different enough to feel impossible. Those subtle sparkles and tiny differences lead back, in a quiet way, to the path already walked tonight. So as the journey starts to fade, it helps to remember where it began. Did you know the first steps were in Kanto, with early glitches and myths about hidden HMs, unreachable patches of grass, and a truck that some claimed could hide Mew, all swirling around simple Game Boy screens that still somehow felt full of secrets. From there, the walk slipped into Johto, where time itself became a gentle mechanic, the clock changing the color of the sky, and the Pokémon that appeared, and where a shrine in a small forest made players wonder if certain knights or certain unknown could quietly call Celebi. Then the route curved toward Hoenn, with tides that rose and fell in Shoal Cave, the water slowly draining away if players waited long enough, revealing items and paths that did not announce themselves, just appeared as if the game had always been breathing in the background. The air grew colder in Sinnoh, with snow in Snowpoint City drifting at different speeds and angles, a tiny detail that made the town feel isolated and peaceful, as if the whole region had pulled a blanket over itself. Later regions followed, from Unova's city lights to Kalos's soft cafes, from Alola's slow island evenings to Galar's foggy routes, and onward to more modern maps, where rumors shifted from secret trucks to hidden forms, strange odds, and the quiet shimmer of rare colors. Along the way, certain themes kept returning, like landmarks on a familiar road. There were quiet mechanics, such as breeding systems and encounter tables, that worked silently under the surface, shaping which Pokémon appeared without ever needing attention. There were hidden details like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, letting the lead Pokémon react in hundreds of different ways, or a single NPC on a pier telling a story most players only read once before moving on. There were gentle NPC stories scattered everywhere, from tired fishermen and lonely hikers to caretakers in towers, and nurses repeating the same soothing lines in every Pokémon Center. There was the comforting consistency of the world itself, where the jingle when a team is healed sounds almost the same across decades, and where routes still bend around small ponds and patches of grass, no matter how the graphics change. By now, attention may have drifted a little, or a lot, and that is completely expected. These facts were meant to be soft enough that thoughts could wander in the middle of a sentence. One common rumor is that missing pieces mean missing out. However, this was easily debunked by the way these games work, because every route, every story, and every small mechanic can be revisited later, just by loading a save or starting again. Although the rumors are false, the feeling behind them remains. So if any detail slipped past half-heard, it is still there, waiting, like a path the player could always walk again, slowly, in their own time. As the words become fewer, the pauses a little longer, and the whole Pokémon world grows very distant and very quiet just beyond closed eyes. So now, as the Pokémon world drifts a little further away, thank you for letting these quiet stories and rumors move through the room, and for staying long enough to follow them from the strangest myths to the calmest facts. like a very slow walk from Pallet Town all the way to some distant, unseen region at the edge of sleep. All of the small details that were mentioned, the hidden mechanics, the strange hoaxes, and the quiet bits of development trivia, can fade out now, as if each one was just another NPC line in a town the player has already visited. Something that could be read again later, but does not need to be held onto in this moment, because it is enough to know they exist somewhere in the background. So if any part of the journey still lingers, did you know it can be allowed to blur, the way the day-night cycle, in gold and silver, slowly turns evening into deep night, until even the outlines of the buildings are only soft shapes, and the idea of time in the Pokemon world becomes as slow and gentle as breathing. The names of regions, the routes and cities, the rumors about hidden areas and fake games can all sink back like the tide in Shoal Cave. The water level changing so gradually that players barely notice until the cave is quiet, empty of footsteps, and only the sound of distant waves remains, somewhere behind the closed lid of a handheld system. If the mind is still a little awake, some claimed that replaying the same soft audio or letting another calm Pokemon video start could help push it further towards sleep, though there is no need to decide anything now and no pressure to tap another title or search for another rumor, because the screen will still be there tomorrow, waiting exactly where it was left. According to some, the most comforting part of these games is not the battles or the secrets at all, but the knowledge that the world inside them does not move without the player, that the snow in Snow Point City will fall at its own slow pace every time the game is opened, and that even if months pass, the scene will greet the player as if no time has gone by. The Pokemon world will remain like that, held inside plastic cartridges and downloaded data, in old memories of schoolyard stories, and in future tales that have not been told yet. So even if this rumor or that fact is forgotten by morning, the feeling of walking through those regions can return whenever it is needed again. So now, imagine a quiet Pokemon Center late at night. The last few NPCs motionless, the nurse standing patiently behind the counter as the familiar healing jingle plays one more time, softer than usual, each note fading a little quicker than the last until the lights dim. The text box disappears, and the whole screen slowly turns to black as the player closes their eyes and lets the sound go completely.